Blue and red light pulsed against the walls of the house, turning the quiet suburban driveway into a strobe-lit stage. The cruiser tires crunched over gravel, stopping dead in front of the garage door. It blocked the path. There was no way out. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted from domestic stillness to immediate, sharp-edged panic. The engine cut, but the lights kept sweeping across the ceiling, rhythmic and relentless. Outside, the car doors opened in unison. The sound of heavy boots hit the pavement. These were not neighbors. They were not visitors. They were authorities, moving with the precision of a raid. Kim Zolciak stood behind the front door, her hand pressing against the wood, the vibration of the sirens rattling the frame. She watched through the narrow slit of the window as the officers stepped into the driveway. Their posture was rigid, their gazes fixed on the front entrance. The beam from a handheld flashlight swept across the porch, illuminating the dust motes in the air. The peace of the neighborhood evaporated, replaced by the heavy, suffocating reality of what was waiting on the other side of the glass. The officers reached the steps, and the night went deathly still. The front door opened before the officers could knock. Kim stood in the threshold, her phone gripped so hard her knuckles turned white. She tried to frame a question, but the words died in her throat as the lead officer stepped forward. He did not offer greetings. He held out a warrant, the paper stiff and clinical in the humid night air. Behind him, the others moved with mechanical efficiency. They called for KJ. He emerged from the hallway, his steps heavy and slow. The officer reached for his belt, and the sharp, metallic snap of handcuffs echoed against the siding of the house. The sound was final, a cold punctuation mark on the life they had known until seconds ago. KJ did not look up. He stared at the concrete path, his shoulders hunched as if trying to shrink away from the flashing lights. Kim watched, her breath shallow and irregular. She reached out a hand, then stopped, her fingers trembling in midair. She remained frozen on the porch, a silent observer to the departure of her own son. The cruisers began to hum as the engines turned over, ready to pull away, leaving her standing in the sudden, hollow silence of the driveway. The front door remained unlocked, a revolving portal for a new kind of visitor. By dawn, the living room had lost its domestic warmth. Two men in dark suits pushed through the entryway, carrying heavy leather briefcases that clicked open with precise, metallic snaps. They did not sit on the furniture, they occupied it. Within hours, the mahogany coffee table disappeared under a mountain of manila folders and legal pads. Every horizontal surface became a staging ground for discovery. Documents were fanned out like a deck of cards, creating a jagged, white landscape across the floor. The air inside the house grew stale, smelling of toner and heavy cardstock rather than home. Advisors paced the perimeter of the rug, their voices low and sharp, dissecting timelines and witness names with clinical detachment. They mapped out strategies, drawing lines through KJ's life on sheets of paper. The kitchen island was covered in sticky notes and highlighted transcripts. Kim watched from the shadows of the hallway as her personal space was systematically dismantled. The house was no longer a home. It had become a fortified, impersonal war room, built to fight a battle that had already breached the front gate. Every stack of paper represented a new wall, every document a new barrier. As the defense began its grim, methodical work, Kim walked the perimeter of the living room, her heels clicking a sharp, relentless rhythm against the hardwood. Each step was a calculated beat in a losing race against time. She pressed the phone to her ear so hard the plastic bit into her skin. "I need answers," she said, her voice tight, cutting through the low murmur of the lawyers. She moved from the window to the kitchen, avoiding the stacks of paper that now littered every chair. When the younger children drifted into the hallway, their eyes wide and searching, Kim pivoted sharply. She steered them away with a firm hand, ushering them toward the back of the house and pulling the heavy door shut behind them. She turned back to the lawyers, her pulse visible in the frantic throb of her neck. She dialed another number, pacing back and forth until the floorboards groaned under the weight of her movement. She barked instructions into the phone, her fingers digging into the edge of the mahogany table. Every call was a desperate reach for control in a room that felt increasingly unmoored. She stopped for a heartbeat, staring at the front gate where cameras were already gathering, then resumed her pacing, the sound of her heels echoing through the hollowed-out space of a home that had lost its center. Upstairs, the door to the bedroom clicked shut, sealing out the frantic energy of the lower level. KJ did not turn on the lights. He pulled the heavy curtains until the fabric overlapped, blocking the afternoon sun and the silhouettes of reporters at the gate. He moved to the bed and sat on the edge, his weight causing the mattress to sink. A tray of food sat on the nightstand, untouched. He did not look at it. He did not reach for it. He lay back, his head hitting the pillow with a dull thud, and focused his gaze on the ceiling. The plaster was cracked in a jagged line that seemed to track the path of his own thoughts. He tracked the shadows moving across the walls, his breathing shallow and slow. He ignored the muffled voices rising from the living room below. He ignored the vibration of his phone on the floor. He remained perfectly still, his eyes wide and unblinking, mapping the ceiling tiles as if they held an answer to the accusations. The room grew cold as the evening light faded, but he did not move to adjust the thermostat. He simply stared, trapped in the silence of his own making, while the walls of the house felt like they were closing in around him. Kim stood at the hallway window, her hand hovering near the edge of the blinds. Outside, the driveway was choked with white vans and camera tripods. A flash went off, bright and intrusive, slicing through the slats. She jerked back, her breath hitching. She heard footsteps behind her. The younger children were coming down the stairs, curious about the commotion. Kim spun around, her face pale, and intercepted them before they could reach the landing. She crouched down, placing her hands firmly on their shoulders, and steered them toward the kitchen. "Go back upstairs," she ordered, her voice steady but strained. She waited until she heard their doors click shut before returning to the living room. She grabbed a heavy blanket and draped it over the window, blocking the gap where the light leaked in. It was a temporary fix. Outside, a producer gestured toward the front door, and a reporter stepped onto the porch. The floorboards vibrated as a heavy knock echoed through the house. Kim stood in the center of the room, her back to the door, listening to the muffled shouts of the media. The walls felt thin, transparent, and completely unable to hold back the world. A tablet slid across the mahogany table, stopping right in front of Kim. Her lawyer tapped the screen, bringing up a series of scrolling logs. She leaned in, her eyes scanning the lines of text. These were not just words. They were timestamps, locations, and direct exchanges that tethered KJ to the scene of the accusation. She tapped on a message, hoping to find a glitch or an error, but the data was locked and verified. Every ping of a notification felt like a hammer strike against the defense they had been building. The narrative of his innocence began to fray. She pushed the tablet away, her palms pressing hard against the wood to stop them from shaking. The digital trail was precise, cold, and entirely damning. She turned toward the staircase, looking up toward his room, then back at the screen. The reality of what those messages proved was far worse than the rumors outside. She reached for the tablet again, scrolling further down, watching the sequence of events unfold in chronological detail. There was no room for misinterpretation. The digital footprint was a map leading straight to a conclusion she had spent weeks refusing to acknowledge. The room went silent, the weight of the evidence pressing down on them with suffocating clarity. The legal team worked through the night, but the files kept growing. A fresh stack of witness statements arrived at dawn, each one adding a new layer of complexity to the case. Kim sat at the edge of the sofa, watching as her lead attorney flipped through the latest depositions. He stopped on one page, his brow furrowing as he read a statement about a specific interaction near the school parking lot. He looked up, his expression hardening. "This contradicts everything we have," he said, his voice dropping to a low, sharp tone. He threw the folder onto the table, and the papers slid across the surface, scattering in the light. The strategy they had held onto for weeks, the idea of a simple misunderstanding, suddenly looked fragile. Kim watched him pace the length of the room, his movements jagged and restless. He pulled out a yellow notepad and began crossing out entire sections of their planned defense. Every stroke of the pen sounded loud in the quiet room. The witnesses were not backing down. They were aligning, providing a consistent chain of events that made the current legal plan impossible to maintain. The atmosphere in the room shifted from confidence to frantic damage control. They were no longer defending a narrative. They were trying to outrun the truth. The lead attorney slammed his hand onto the dining table, the sound echoing through the house. "We cannot work with a client who refuses to see the math," he stated, his jaw tight. Kim stood, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She pointed toward the hallway, her voice rising in a sharp, jagged pitch. "Your job is to defend, not to judge." The room felt smaller, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and unwashed nerves. An associate shifted in the corner, clutching a stack of files against his chest, refusing to make eye contact. The tension snapped. One advisor stood up, gathered his laptop, and shoved it into his bag with violent efficiency. He looked at Kim, his eyes cold and devoid of the previous professional warmth. "If you want to live in a fantasy, do it without us." The threat hung in the air, undeniable and final. Kim didn't back down. She crossed her arms, her knuckles white. Trust had evaporated, replaced by raw, defensive hostility. The advisors began moving toward the front door, their footsteps heavy and hurried. Kim watched them go, her breathing shallow, the silence that followed more terrifying than the shouting had been. She was alone in the room, surrounded by papers that no longer meant anything. The silence in the house was short-lived. A low rumble of tires on the gravel driveway drew Kim to the front window. A police cruiser sat under the porch light, its engine idling with a rhythmic, mechanical pulse. She didn't have time to process the sight before the front door knocker vibrated through the frame. She opened it to find two officers, their faces blank and professional, holding a stack of legal documents. They did not wait for an invitation. They stepped past her into the foyer, their boots tracking grit onto the clean floor. Kim started to speak, but the lead officer held up a hand, silencing her with a sharp look. They moved toward the study where the laptops and tablets were kept. Kim followed, her hands clutching the doorframe as they began clearing the shelves. They bagged chargers, hard drives, and phones with clinical precision. Every metallic clink of a device hitting a plastic evidence bag felt like another piece of her life being dismantled. She tried to ask a question, but they focused only on the hardware, ignoring her presence entirely. As they walked back out into the night, the weight of the search felt absolute. Kim leaned against the wall, watching the taillights fade, realizing there was nothing left to hide behind. The house settled into a heavy, unnatural quiet. Every floorboard creak sounded like a footstep. Every shadow in the corner looked like an intruder. Kim moved through the rooms with jerky, uncoordinated motions, picking up books only to set them back down without reading. She avoided the study entirely. The space where the devices had been felt like a hollow cavity in the center of the home. Upstairs, the door to the bedroom remained shut. No sound came from behind it, not even the hum of a television or the rustle of movement. The air grew stale, trapped by the drawn curtains and the lack of life. Then, the phone on the kitchen counter vibrated. It was a sharp, persistent sound that shattered the stillness. Kim stared at the screen for a long beat before she reached for it. An email from the lead counsel. The date for the deposition was set. It was only 3 days away. She swiped the notification away, but the information remained burned into her vision. The walls seemed to draw closer, tightening the space until breathing felt like a conscious effort. She walked to the window and looked out at the street. Everything outside looked normal, but the clock on the wall ticked with a new, aggressive rhythm. The countdown had begun, and there was no way to pause it. The lobby of the law firm was cold, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. Kim walked to the elevators, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a sharp, echoing rhythm. KJ followed a few steps behind, his gaze fixed on the floor. They reached the conference room door, and the lawyer held it open, gesturing for them to enter. The room was dominated by a long, polished table that reflected the harsh overhead lights. A stenographer sat in the corner, fingers poised over a machine, waiting. Kim took a seat at the far end, pulling her bag into her lap to keep her hands occupied. Across from her, the opposing counsel laid out a thick folder, the pages crisp and intimidating. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning unit. The defense attorney checked his watch, adjusted his tie, and leaned forward. He didn't speak. He simply looked at the stenographer and nodded. The deposition was officially underway. No one moved. The air felt thin, stripped of all warmth. Every person in the room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the first word to break the tension. The legal battle had shifted from the house to this windowless space, and there was no turning back now. The witness leaned toward the microphone, the plastic chair creaking under the weight of the moment. She did not hesitate. She opened a thin ledger and began to recite a series of timestamps. Each one was a nail in the coffin of the defense. She detailed the exact minute she had seen KJ at the location, corroborated by digital logs of a nearby security system. Kim shifted in her seat, her fingers digging into the fabric of the armrest until her knuckles turned white. The defense attorney, who had been leaning back with practiced indifference, suddenly stiffened. He reached for a document, his hand hovering over the page before he pulled it back. The stenographer's fingers flew across the keys, the clatter filling the void in the room. The witness finished with a final, damning detail about a specific message sent from a device. The defense attorney let his pen slip from his hand. It clattered against the table, sounding like a gunshot in the sterile quiet. He looked at the timeline on the screen, then at the attorney opposite him. The alibi was not just fraying, it was unraveling in real time. KJ stared at the table, his jaw tightening, as the weight of the evidence pressed down on every person in the room. The prosecutor did not stop. He projected a map onto the wall, tracing a line of travel that made the previous alibi impossible. He highlighted the phone pings, the sequence of timestamps, and the definitive location data. Every piece of evidence fit together like a lock clicking shut. The defense attorney stood up, his voice sharp as he shouted an objection, but the opposing side barely glanced at him. The judge overruled the objection with a single dismissive wave of a hand. The map remained on the screen, a visual cage. Kim felt the room tilt. She reached for the edge of the table, her fingernails scraping against the polished wood. Beside her, KJ stopped breathing for a second, his chest still. His eyes locked on the digital path that proved he was exactly where he claimed he was not. The defense attorney slumped back into his chair, the fire in his eyes replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He pushed the stack of papers away, signaling the end of the argument. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the hum of the projector fan. There was no more room for denial. The wall of defense had crumbled, leaving only the cold, mechanical truth exposed for everyone to see. The defense attorney stared at the final log, his face draining of all color. He did not look at the prosecution. He did not look at the judge. He slowly pulled the folder toward the center of the desk, aligning the edges with trembling fingers. The sound of the paper sliding against the wood was the loudest noise in the room. He closed the cover, pressing down on it until his knuckles turned ashen. He turned his head, his gaze meeting Kim's, and the mask of professional confidence finally slipped away. He did not speak immediately. He took a long, ragged breath, his chest rising and falling in a stuttering rhythm. When he finally leaned in, his voice was barely a whisper, stripped of all legal jargon. He told her the evidence was insurmountable. There was no path forward, no angle to argue, and no witness left to call. He pushed the folder away, leaving it sitting in the center of the table like a tombstone. Kim looked at the stack of documents, then back at the attorney, searching for a sign of hesitation or a hidden strategy. She found nothing but the grim finality in his eyes. The case was effectively over, and the weight of the coming verdict settled into the very foundation of the room. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open, and the air inside was thick, stale, and cold. Kim stepped across the threshold, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo for miles. The room was packed. Every bench was occupied. As she moved toward the front row, she felt the gaze of the crowd shift, sticking to her like wet paper. She kept her chin down, but the weight of those eyes was physical, pressing into her shoulders, forcing her to shrink. She found her seat and gripped the edge of the pew until her knuckles throbbed. To her left, the gallery hummed with a low-frequency murmur that rose and fell like a tide. She looked for a friendly face, someone to break the wall of hostility, but saw only cameras and reporters with notebooks poised. Every person in the room was waiting for the fall. She tried to steady her breathing, but the air felt thin, as if the room itself were slowly closing in. The space between the benches felt narrow, leaving her exposed on all sides. She looked ahead at the judge's bench, a towering structure of dark, polished wood, and realized there was nowhere left to hide. The public scrutiny was total, an inescapable gravity pulling her toward the center of the storm. A door clicked open behind the bench. The judge entered, the heavy folds of the black robe sweeping across the floor. He sat, the chair groaning under his weight, and the courtroom fell into a vacuum of sound. Not a single person shifted, not a camera shutter clicked. The judge placed a single page on the wood and smoothed it with his palm. He began to read. He spoke the charges with a flat, rhythmic cadence, each syllable carving a deeper line into the atmosphere. The word sexual assault hung in the air, heavy and sharp. KJ stood before the bench, his hands gripped behind his back so tightly his fingers turned white. He did not blink. The judge finished the final count, looked up, and raised the gavel high. The strike was immediate. The wood hit the base with the force of a gunshot, the sound vibrating through the floorboards and into the marrow of the room. It was done. The sharp crack echoed against the high ceilings, a sudden, violent end to the proceedings. KJ flinched as if struck, his knees buckling an inch before he regained his posture. The gavel's strike hung in the silence, a final, irreversible death knell for his life as he knew it. The echo of the gavel faded into a silence so dense it felt physical. Kim leaned forward, her eyes darting toward the back of the room, scanning the faces of the spectators as if searching for a producer, a director, or a camera signal to cut the scene. She reached for her phone in her pocket, a reflex born of years of controlling the narrative, but her fingers stopped mid-motion. There was no editor here, no clever cut to hide the shame, no retake. The air in the room was stagnant, smelling of floor wax and old paper. The judge stood up, his face an impassive mask of bureaucratic resolve. Kim watched the bailiffs move toward the bench, their movements precise, mechanical, and entirely unconcerned with the family's legacy. The reality of the law settled over the room like a heavy, leaden shroud. It was not a performance. There were no retakes or script adjustments to soften the outcome. The evidence was documented. The verdict was rendered, and the consequences were now fixed in stone. She gripped the wooden rail of the pew until her hands ached, finally seeing the truth. The cameras were gone, the audience was irrelevant, and the machinery of the justice system was entirely indifferent to her world. The bailiffs moved forward, the rhythmic clink of metal against leather filling the void. They stopped on either side of KJ. The movement was clinical, devoid of empathy, forcing the boy to turn away from the bench. As he shifted, he paused. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at the exit. He turned his head until his eyes locked with those of his mother in the front row. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it felt like a canyon. His face was devoid of the bravado that had once defined his presence. He looked younger, smaller, his eyes rimmed with a sudden, sharp clarity of what was lost. His lips parted, but no sound escaped. It was an apology written in the stillness of his posture, a confession of the wreckage he had brought upon them both. Kim reached out, her fingers brushing the air, but a bailiff's hand clamped firmly onto KJ's arm, pivoting him toward the heavy exit. The connection snapped. KJ's gaze lingered for one heartbeat longer, a desperate anchor in a sea of indifference, before the momentum of the guards dragged him away toward the dark corridor. He did not look back again. The heavy oak doors groaned on their hinges. KJ moved into the shadow of the corridor, his frame shrinking until he was nothing more than a silhouette against the dim hallway light. Then, the doors began their slow, deliberate swing. The sound was distinct, a heavy, thudding vibration that rippled through the floorboards of the courtroom. The latch caught with a sharp, metallic snap. The echo of that final click hung in the air for several seconds, slowly dissipating into the rafters. Kim sat motionless. The room had transformed from a place of public scrutiny into a hollow, airless cavern. She looked at the wood grain of the doors, tracing the dark knots in the grain. There was no sound left to track. The reporters were gone. The lawyers had packed their briefcases and vanished into the city. She remained in the front row, her hands resting flat on her knees. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a low, buzzing drone that filled the space where voices had been moments before. She looked toward the empty bench, then back to the closed doors. The trial had reached its end. The life she had known was now contained on the other side of that barrier. She did not stand. She simply stared at the threshold, surrounded by the weight of absolute, crushing silence.